Let's begin our deep dive into requirements. The first thing I want to go over is the requirements definition. It's something that we are all on the same page with. So we all understand what I mean by requirements. So requirements are a way of figuring out the exact specifications of what the software should do. You can think of requirements like a definition. You're defining what the software should do. It's like you're looking it up in a book and you're able to read exactly what the software should do. And that's important. We're not trying to figure out how it should be created. We're just trying to figure out what it should do in the end. If a user interacts with it here, or if a user interacts with it there, what is going to happen? What do we want to happen? What is the purpose of this system? And that is why it is a process for finding out the goals of a system. So in the end, the requirements are just trying to find out the goals of the system. What do we want it to accomplish? It captures the what and not the how. That's important, is we're just trying to figure out the what, not how we're trying to create it. The how is for design. A lot of people might come up with a requirement of we'll use CSS and HTML to build the front end. And that's not a requirement. That is the how. That's what we're going to be using to build the front end. And so therefore that is a part of the design. A requirement might be uses a email address field to capture email address, or we want to capture the email address and a comment. So we're not telling how we're going to do that. We're not trying to define technology on how we're trying to do that. We're just saying, what do we want the user to be able to do? What do we want the end goal to be? And overall, the requirements usually creates a document which lays out all of these details. Usually there's there's bullet lists, or there's, if it's real official, you have like requirement 4.2a or something like that. But a lot of times, if you're just working for like medium or small companies, it'll just be sort of a list of the things that you want to accomplish and the use cases that you want the users to go with. So then let's cover the importance of requirements. Why do we use requirements? What is it saving us in the end? It just sounds like, we're just spending more time when we could be coding. Well, with all engineering, and this is important, is that any engineering you do, you have this sort of golden rule. And the golden rule is that spending time strategically up front reduces cost and time later on. Now, this is data from a study that showed if you spent strategic time up front, the reason I say strategic is I'm not just talking about, before we design the thing, just talking back and forth for, 40 hours. We want to actually be, focused work here, designing it, finding potential problems, finding all of the possible use cases, creating basically the code before we even touch the code. That's what I'm talking about. So spending time strategically up front reduces cost and time later on. And this is sort of the trend here. And you'll notice that the trend is a little bit of a sort of like this trend of wasted time. So there is a point where it doesn't, help you to use more upfront time. So, if we're going to spend 50% of all time, it's not going to do much of a change here. It's not actually going to reduce the overrun cost. And you'll notice that this doesn't go down to zero. That's because most projects always go over. 40% over the budget is kind of the norm. And a lot of times it gets up in these big numbers because people don't plan accordingly. But this is just saying of the total time here. So this is time total. What we're talking about is if we spend 0% of our time, so we're spending absolutely no time up front, the typical cost overrun is 200%. If we spend roughly 3% and roughly 5%, we hit 100% and 50%. So if we just spend 5% of all of our time, very, very small chunk of time, if we spend 100 hours, we're talking about 5 hours up front just going over this thing, we can save ourselves 150% of extra overrun. And this is cost overrun in both dollars and in time. So it's both of these, usually because the two go hand in hand with one another. If it takes longer, it's going to cost more. You're paying your engineers, you're paying for healthcare, you're paying for taxes, you're paying all this stuff. And the longer it takes for you to start making your money back, the more it's going to cost. And then if we go 10 to 20%, we get that golden area where we get just the 40% overrun. And so, what's the difference between this? Let's say that we spend 0% upfront and the project should have taken 200 hours. Well, that's just some simple math here. It's going to have a 200% overrun, which means we are looking 100% overrun would be 400. So a 200% overrun is going to be about 600 hours to complete this project when it should have only taken 200. That's a giant jump right there of time that it should have taken. Where if we just put 5%, so in that 200-hour project, if we had just designated 5% or 10 hours, then we would be only at a 50% overrun, which means our total would be 300 hours. So with 10 hours of effort here, we actually saved ourselves 300 hours of back-end problems. And that's just sort of like the power of all of this, is that spending time up front helps out. Requirements document is one of those things to spend the time up front, and same with the design document. But both of these are very important. They get us on the same page and they get us working efficiently.